Hello and welcome to another episode of Introduction to Windows Server 2012 and 2016 Administration. This course does cover a lot of the BOAC 70-410. It's based on the 70-410 installation and configuring Windows Server 2012 R2. However, a lot of the material that we're talking about in here is perfectly applicable to Server 2016 as well. And of course, we are augmenting this series with a lot of basic administrative, particularly in Active Directory administrative tasks that you're going to be expected to know if you take on a server admin job in the real world. Today's focus really does boil down to exam objective 5.3, talking about creating and managing Active Directory groups and organizational units. This really covers chapter 15 if you're following along in the book. So we're going to look at the Active Directory domain structure today and focus on organizational units versus groups. We'll talk about what types of groups are out there, how we can use groups to facilitate access to resources on the network. We'll look at organizational units in a lot of detail as well today. And then finally, we'll finish with the fishy chicky example. We'll go into the domain controller and show you a little bit of organizational units and working with groups before we finish up the segment today. So as far as the Active Directory domain structure, we've talked about subdomains before. Subdomains are really great if we're looking to essentially reset all the group policies, security, and administrative rules for a particular set of objects that are going to dwell within it. But subdomains and even new domains are going to create a whole new level of administrative overhead that, quite frankly, you do not need or want unless it's absolutely needed for any kind of internal organizational structure. You also have to remember that creating a new domain really means deploying additional domain controllers. And while it's possible to go in and rename domains, it's really not a fun process at all. So within a domain, we really refer to the organizational unit as the primary hierarchical building block. And by default, there's only one built-in OU when we create that Active Directory, and that is the domain controller's OU. Domain controllers have to operate from a different set of rules than all of the other objects by default in the Active Directory, so that domain controller's OU has its own group policy associated with it so that it can facilitate access to the domain. All the other organizational units are going to fall to you to be manually created so that you can facilitate whatever objectives you're trying to do with those organizational units. Organizational units inherit all the rules that are set above it in the Active Directory hierarchy. So if I'm in the root of the domain and I want to set a password policy and I set that password policy to be enforced throughout the entire domain, then I know that every organizational unit inside of that and so on will have to abide by that password policy. Likewise, organizational units give us a lot of flexibility because I have the ability to manage group policies within those organizational units as well. We'll talk about that in a minute. It is a very simple manner to create a new organizational unit. I have the ability to rename it. I can rename an existing one. I can move them around. They're very flexible. So what are the reasons for creating organizational units? Well, if you go by Microsoft's philosophy of organizational units, one of the primary driving forces is to duplicate organizational divisions. So the structure of organizational units in your domain can be a reflection of the model that you've used to design your Active Directory domain structure. So if I want to set up organizational unit divisions, I can do it, say, geographically, departmentally, politically, and so on. I can assign group policy settings. So if I'm going to be changing the rules in which a group of objects in the domain are going to play by, then creating an organizational unit to facilitate that is warranted. Likewise, if I want to delegate administration, so I want to grant certain individuals the administrative responsibility for a portion of the Active Directory hierarchy, I don't want them to have access to the full domain tree, then I can facilitate that with an organizational unit as well. You have to remember, though, that organizational units do require their own level of additional administrative overhead, and they have the ability to complicate the application of group policy settings. So it's really easy to overdo OUs, especially in smaller organizations. So how inheritance works with organizational units. When you set up and assign group policy settings to the root of the domain, as I said earlier, those settings will by default apply to all objects in that domain, but not subdomains. If I assign group policy settings to an organizational unit, those settings are going to apply to all of the leaf objects in that organizational unit and going to be inherited by all subordinate organizational units that are contained within that organizational unit itself. We can nest organizational units inside other organizational units. However, they do create their own set of complications, so you do not want to do this very often. They have the ability to slow down how the Active Directory works. So just be careful and use nesting of organizational units sparingly, only when you absolutely have no other recourse. If group policies are set to the level above an organizational unit, then those policies are going to be enforced by default to all the objects placed inside the organizational unit itself. We do have ways to force an organizational unit to adapt policies within that are set to that organizational unit. We do have the ability to turn off inheritance to an organizational unit as well, but we'll talk a little bit more about those when we look at group policies. Most access needs, however, do not require and cannot be accomplished with an organizational unit. We're going to want to use security groups instead to facilitate access to resources in the domain. And so people do get oftentimes confused whether we need an organizational unit for a group of resources or a security group. So really I tell my folks, answer this question. If I have a group of users and I want to change the rules on how those users play, new desktops, new default settings for applications, new home pages for Internet Explorer, then a group policy will have to be applied to an organizational unit to facilitate that. Therefore, an organizational unit is necessary. Likewise, if I have a group of objects and I want somebody special to administer those objects, then an organizational unit is going to be warranted for that. If it passes the litmus test on one or the other or both of these, then an organizational unit is warranted for that group of objects. Otherwise, just consider creating a security group to manage the access that those objects are going to need to files, folders, applications, servers and computers, printers, and so on. Creating organizational units does allow administrators to decentralize administrative responsibilities. I can delegate authority to other admins for specific organizational units. This is particularly helpful in very large organizations where we have multiple IT departments disseminated throughout the organization, each one with its own set of users or departments that they're responsible for. I also can set policies at the root level in the domain and enforce those policies throughout the domain. If I do not have a policy that's configured at the root level or not set for enforce, then my administrative staff for that organizational unit do have the ability to override those group policies and apply their own set of group policies to their organizational unit levels. One of the nice things about setting up my domain admins this way and delegating responsibility to them based on organizational unit is that I don't have to really worry about them creating errors on the root or having access to the root Active Directory tree. I can leave that responsibility to myself or to a very select group of people that I can entrust to manage the whole tree. And so thereby pretty much reducing the level of scope of Active Directory errors that I'm going to see. When I want to create an organizational unit, particularly through the GUI interface, I have two ways to do that. I can create an organizational unit either by using the Active Directory Administrative Console, here seen on the upper right, or what I refer to as the old school method by going into the Active Directory Users and Groups, right-selecting, New, and then Organizational Unit. So let's shift to group objects for a little bit. There are two different types of groups, security groups and distribution groups. Security groups are used to provide access to the resources for a particular set of users, files, folders, devices, applications, anything on the network. Distribution groups are really used for disseminating information, particularly for email applications. If you're running Microsoft Exchange or Outlook or even Office 365, then you're going to need distribution groups to help facilitate the movement of information. More often than not, though, if you're an admin, security groups is where it's at for a majority of the administrative tasks you're going to be performing. Now, if you're an Exchange admin or an Outlook admin, then you're going to become more intimately familiar with distribution groups. So when do I want to use a security group? Just to reiterate what I've said earlier, groups are going to be used to collect similar resources together and then applying access permissions for those resources. We really don't like to use usernames, for instance, and add usernames to files and folders on the file server. We would rather create groups, even a group for one person, and use the group and add the group to the ACLs of files, folders, and devices and manage the permissions that way. We refer to that as group management, not to be confused with group policies. But group management really allows us to set up a file server, for instance. Once we've set it up with the appropriate groups, with the appropriate permissions to access those files and folders based on the role that they play in the organization, then I should never have to touch that file server again unless I'm creating a new folder or a new group or making some sort of change to the structure itself. All I have to do is add or remove a user from the particular group, and I can be assured that they'll have the access that they need to all the files and folders and devices and so on that I have set up for that group. I can also use a security group whenever I want to grant a collection of users' permissions to access to network resources, a printer, a computer, and so on. You got to remember, though, groups are not part of the Active Directory hierarchy, and therefore you cannot assign a group policy to it. Members of a group inherit any permissions that you assign to that particular group, but they're not going to inherit the group policy settings from the group's parent organizational units and domain. Another option is containers. The default container objects for Active Directory consist of users and computers. The user container does contain all the domains, predefined users, and groups. And whenever I create a group, more often than not, if I can't find it, I can look in the users folder and it'll turn up there. The computers group contains all the computers objects in the domain. So every time I add a computer to the domain, unless I have selected somewhere else for that to be added by default, I can know it's going to show up in the computer container. Once those objects are in those containers, I am free to move them about the Active Directory tree as I see fit to accomplish the administrative task I have for those users and computers. I also have the ability to create additional containers. However, by default, that has been disabled. You can follow along in another how-to segment on how to re-enable this feature, and then you can apply, say, maybe your groups into that container as a way to organize them and so on. You cannot assign group policy settings specifically to a user or a computer object or delegate their administration. Back to groups. So we do have something called group scopes. Group scopes are available in Active Directory in the domain, and they include three types of group scopes. There's the domain local groups, domain global groups, and universal groups. So that's domain local, global, and universal groups. The group scope is really what's going to control which objects in that a group can hold, and the scope can limit objects to the same domain or permit objects from other remote domains. And last but not least, scopes have the ability to control the location in the domain or forest where the group can be used. So let's look at these three groups in more detail. Domain local groups, generally the first set of groups, can have any of the following as members: user and computer accounts, global groups from any domain in the forest, universal groups, and any other domain local groups from the same domain. Global groups can have user and computer accounts and other global groups from the same domain. Last but not least, universal groups have the ability to have user and computer accounts, global groups from any domain in the forest, and other universal groups. This leads us to the ability to nest groups. That term is called group nesting. And I have the ability to allow users from multiple domains to access a resource in a parent domain by nesting groups into each other to facilitate that. So I can create global groups in each domain that contain all users needing access to an enterprise database, for instance. Then I can create a universal group in the parent domain and then include each location's global group as a member. And I can add the universal group to the required domain local group to assign the necessary permission to access and use that particular enterprise database. That's how nesting groups works to facilitate access for objects in remote domains into the enterprise itself. There are some default groups out there that you need to be aware of. Several built-in security groups were created when you built your Active Directory. Many of those groups reside in the user's container. You've probably seen that already. These built-in groups have predefined user rights that enable their members to perform certain system-related tasks. Things like being able to back up and restore. I can add accounts to those default groups to grant users the same rights, in addition to any resource access permissions that the group possesses. The whole purpose of being able to use these built-in groups is to set up some predefined administrative tasks, for instance, that my administrative users can facilitate for access on the domain. If I want people to back up servers, there's a predefined group for it already. I don't have to go in and configure that group. I can tweak that group maybe a little bit and then apply my users to that are going to be backing up servers. Another type of group, even though it's not really considered a group, is the special identities. Special identities can be used, however, as groups by simply adding the special identities to the ACLs on, say, files and folders, and then assigning permissions to them. Special identities do contain members dynamically based on whether or not they meet appropriate criteria at that moment in time. So when they no longer meet the criteria, then they're no longer associated with that particular special identity. You do not, as an administrator, have the ability to create them, delete them, or directly modify who can go in and out of that group. It really boils down to if that user meets a certain set of parameters, they suddenly become a member of that special identity. They're not going to be a manageable object either in the ADS utilities. So let's look at some special identities that will help you understand this concept better. Authenticated users is a good one. All users with a valid local and domain user account whose identities have been authenticated suddenly become authenticated users. This special identity will not include the guest user even if the guest account has a password. The creator-owner special identity is the account for the user who created or took ownership of a resource. There's also other special identities. Dial-up, for instance. All users who are currently logged in through a dial-up connection are part of the dial-up special identity. Everyone consists of the authenticated user special identity plus the guest user account, but it doesn't consider the anonymous logon special identity as part of the everyone group. There's the interactive special identity. All users who are currently logged on locally through a remote desktop connection are considered part of the interactive special identity group. And the network special identity consists of all users who are currently logged on through a network connection. And if you're connected through remote desktop, then you're part of the remote desktop users group. Creating groups is a pretty simple task, and just like the organizational units, we have two ways in the GUI to create them. We can either create them through the Active Directory Administrative Console or through the old school Active Directory Users and Groups method. We have the ability to create groups through the command line as well. The basic syntax for creating group objects with the ds_add looks something like this. We have ds_add group, and then you add your parameters to that to facilitate the creation of the group. I also have the ability to create Windows PowerShell. There is actually a PowerShell add group commandlet associated with PowerShell that you can use, and it looks actually something like this when you actually use it correctly. In the first example here, where I have the say new add group, then it's going to allow me to it's going to prompt me for the group scope and the name for the group. The group scope being whether it's a domain local group, a global group, or a universal group, and then the name is just the name of the group, that whatever you want to call it. It's going to create that group in the user's container, where afterwards I can move it to whatever appropriate organizational unit or AD folder I want to. The example at the bottom shows you what happens when I decide to create a group and use all of these parameters that you see here as a single command. So new -AD group, and then space -name, and then the name of the group, and so on. This is a very quick way to create a group through the PowerShell that will allow you to more finely tune the properties of that group, and you can do it as one pass, and then the group is created. Also have the ability to manage group objects with Dsmod.exe. It is pretty much the primary command that allows me to modify Active Directory groups. The Dsmod group, for example, can be used to add the administrator user to the guest group with the command that you see here at the bottom of the screen. Last but not least, we probably all talk about deleting groups. When you delete a group, Windows is not going to ever use that same security identifier for that group again. Even if I create a new group with the same name immediately afterwards, I am not going to be able to restore access permissions that I had assigned to the resources for that original group. The Active Directory group will have to be reapplied to the ACLs that I had originally set up with the first group. And I'll have to set permissions for each of those ACLs all over again, as if I had never created the group before. You also have to remember that deleting a group does not delete any of the objects that were members of the group, simply the group itself, and it will delete that group out of the ACLs or remove the permissions associated with it. Alright, so before we move into our demonstration of creating organizational units and setting up groups, I do want to take a look at my organizational chart. We always refer back to the organizational chart when we start thinking about setting up groups and organizational units. And you can see that this organizational chart is color coordinated. That's going to be very useful for us, and you'll see I've created some organizational units that kind of are facilitated by the colors. If you notice that the yellowish color here on the far left, that all these deal with the plant management, the shifts, and plant maintenance. And if you look on the far right, the greenish color, you'll see that sales and marketing, public relations, sales, market, all those things are kind of green colored. So I kind of looked at, as I looked at this organizational chart, I decided that there were a couple ways I could set up my domain. And if I go into my domain controller here, you'll see I have created some organizational units. I created an organizational unit for my IT folks. And the reason why I created my organizational unit for IT is because there are going to be some significant changes in the group policy settings that my IT administrators are going to have to follow. Likewise, I also decided that my production people, all the plant people, and all the administrative people are going to have some changes in group policy as well. So I went ahead and created organizational units for both of those. You'll also notice that I renamed that container that I created early on in the earlier how-to segment when I showed you how to enable containers. I decided I wanted to keep my groups, or try keeping my security groups, all together in one container. I really didn't want to apply any organizational any group policies to it, any other organizational administrative stuff to it. So I just wanted to create a single container to do that. And if I go into there, you'll see that I have no groups currently. But I do have some new groups that I've created and by default, they were created in this users group. I have the finance group and I have marketing. And I'm going to go ahead and move those into that group container just by dragging it over like so. It's going to say, bear in mind that these, if you're moving it into a new container, if it's an organizational unit, new rules are going to apply, old rules are going to go away. Yes, that's fine. And I'm going to move this executive over to my groups like so. And I'm going to move marketing over just like this. Okay. By default, a lot of admins put all of their groups in the users folder. That's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It all depends on your management style or your IT team's management style. There are so many differences. If you build this or you're building this out alongside what we're doing in this course, there may be 15 different ways that we'll look at Active Directory, and they're all going to be slightly different. Doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that your administrative style may be different. So if I go in and I look at my groups, you'll see I now have 3 groups here. Let's just go ahead and create another group. And let's see, new group. And we're going to say Vice President or VP Marketing. Or VP, I don't know, let's go back. Let's see who we can VP here. VP Production, that sounds good. So VP Production. You'll see it also creates the SAM account name here for pre-Windows 2000. That's fine. For most of the time, this is not going to be an issue. By default, it is set for a global group, a global security group. If you're running one domain and you're not doing any group nesting, global groups is the way to go. Select OK. And there you go, VP Production. I really don't like the way that looks though, so let's rename it. Let's say rename. And I like to have that P capitalized there just to re-accent that a little bit. Yep, I'll change it here too. I'll say OK. All right, so why did I create a group for one person? Well, I created a group for one person because I'm going to eventually apply this group as we move further into the series. When we build our file server and we start applying permissions to our files and folders in the file server, I am going to want to do everything with groups. I am not going to want to do onesie and twosies with users because it's a lot easier. Vice Presidents production are going to come and go. And it's a lot easier to move them in and out of a group than it is to go into the file server and move them around or delete them out and add new users. So even if it's a group of one person, you will find in the long term it's going to be more advantageous as an administrator to do everything through group management. Also, while we're at it, let's go ahead and add a user to this. So it just so happens I've created a user. What is this user? I think I have a user for finance. So I am going to say properties, and I'm going to say members, and I am going to add my user. Let me show you what that user is, by the way. All users, of course, when you create them, unless you specify in the command line or you right-click over here and say new user, then those users by default are going to be created in the user folder. So I sure do have a user here. His name is Harold Hamster. Mr. Harold Hamster should be here somewhere. Harold Hamster down at the bottom. Didn't alphabetize it. Let's click that and alphabetize him. So here's Harold Hamster. It says he's a finance auditor. Probably makes sense for him to be in the finance group. What do you think? So I can drag him into this group here. I can go in and I can say properties, members, and all I gotta do is say add and type Harold. I don't even have to type the whole name or remember the whole name. I can say check. I only have one Harold in there. Harold Hamster. Say OK. And now I know that if I go into there, he's part of a finance group. That's going to be useful to us as we move along in the series. All right. So if maybe I want to create another organizational unit here. So let's go back to our organizational chart, and let's see if there is another organizational unit. I've got everything kind of organized here for production over here, administrative over here. Let's say that our executives are going to have a new desktop or something like that. And I want to facilitate that. So I'm going to right click on here. I don't think I have one for that. So I'm going to say up here, Fishy Chicky. I'm going to the root of my domain because I want the organizational unit to be off the root of the domain. I'm going to say new, and I'm going to say organizational unit. And I can't really call it executive, so what can I call it? I can call it top brass. How about that? Top brass. That sounds good. So top brass, we know that that is going to be all of the big wigs, people on the board, the president of the organization, maybe even the vice presidents, haven't decided yet. But we know that we're going to be changing the rules for some of these big players at the top of the organization. So I've created an organization that way. And when I add users into this organizational unit, those properties that I'm going to associate with this organizational unit will be facilitated down to those user objects. All right, looks like a good demonstration here on how to create an organizational unit, how to create a user group, and how to add users to security groups for the purpose of facilitating access to resources. All right, well, let's summarize then. So organizational units, or OUs as we like to call them, and security groups do make up a significant portion of the daily Active Directory workload for an administrator. Organizational units should be used anytime you wish to change the rules for specific grouping of objects in Active Directory. If I want to change group policy settings, maybe I want to decentralize my administrative responsibilities and let my admin staff manage different parts of the Active Directory tree. Organizational units will facilitate that. There are two kinds of groups, security groups and distribution groups. And unless you're an Exchange server admin, you're probably not going to be too concerned with distribution groups. Your focus is really going to be on security groups. Security groups allow admins to apply permissions to Active Directory objects and to resources found on the network. That is their primary focus. And it's entirely feasible that you'll have a whole department, a whole division of people that do not need an organizational unit because you can facilitate all of their access through the use of a security group or a group of security groups. Groups can be used instead of users in the access control lists of resources. And that is actually the preferred method for what we do. We call that group management, and using group management as a policy is going to simplify your administrative tasks over the long run. I will guarantee it. I will stake money on it. There are also 3 group scopes to be aware of: domain local, global, and universal. And we have the ability to nest them through group nesting to allow dissimilar people and dissimilar organizational areas of the domains access to other resources and other domains within the universal scope of the forest. Group membership can also be managed using group policy. When you create restricted groups, this is something we really didn't talk about, but we can actually go into group policy and decide who's going to be part of a specific group. And then I can create restricted group policies that I can specify the membership for a particular group and then enforce it at a higher level so that no one can add or remove members except me as a domain admin. Well, I guess that pretty much sums up lesson 6. We'll come back and we'll look at Active Directory a lot further, and I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks a lot.